Once again, thanks for joining me. Today we are reflecting and we'll retell the story of Palm Sunday, the day that you might say kicks off a whole series of events of Passion Week that culminates in Good Friday and Easter. And we'll be looking to the text from Matthew 11, where we read of Jesus approaching Bethphage, which literally meant a house of unripe figs. And Bethphage was less than a mile southeast of Jerusalem. So it's not a long or a far distance. And Bethany, we also read of Bethany, and that literally meant a house of dates or figs, and that's about 2 miles out. And there is also in that area the Mount of Olives, which I've read was this high ridge, right, was about 2 miles long. And of course, it was known for its many olive trees, hence the Mount of Olives. And so if you were going to go to Jericho from Jerusalem, Bethany was your last stop, if you will, before a desolate and quite possibly an unsafe road. And Bethany was the village where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. It was also the place where Jesus generally stayed when he was in Judea. And so, as I've talked about before, right, the Passover was a big deal for the Jews. It's one of those required events for attendance. And so the Passover is coming up and people have been starting to flood into Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was going to be stuffed with people. And I've read that, of course, the Romans were aware of that and they would have soldiers on hand. One source I believe I read said they would have 600 people. 600 soldiers stationed at all times on guard. So there would have been more. But ready if there was a problem that developed. And so Jesus, in preparation, as they're going to go up to, like good Jews, and so in preparation, Jesus sends two of his disciples ahead to a village, which we assume is Bethphage, to get an unbroken colt of a donkey. And he says, go, this is where you'll find it. And right, as you enter, you'll see it. And here's what you say if you're challenged. And so they go. Sure enough, they find this unbroken colt of a donkey, and they go to untie it. And of course, yes, they're challenged. And so they say what they're told, the Lord has need of it, and they're allowed to bring the colt. And so they go back. And they don't have saddles, for one thing. And then they throw some of their outer garments on the back of this colt. And also people so for Jesus to sit on. And they're, recognizing, at least in small part, and maybe more, depending on who they are, but certainly disciples recognizing who Jesus is, that Jesus is not just one of them. And in Old Testament time, this is what you did for important people, such as we'll see evidence of a king. Now, of course, the difference is a king would be riding a war horse generally, as he might be coming back from battle, and people would throw their cloaks down and putting branches out. And so this is what's happening. People are doing this for him and for Jesus. And of course, it's just not the disciples. There's all these other people that are traveling the road to go to Jerusalem. And so some of these people would know who Jesus was. They either would know him from seeing him, they might know him by reputation, and there's people that don't know him either. It's a mixture of people that are going in. But it wasn't an uncommon practice, certainly, for there to be singing. They had created songs or psalms that were sung, so we might say songs of ascent. But they'd go up and they would sing some of these psalms, such as the Psalms of 113 through 118 to express thanksgiving and praise and petitions to God. And so what we have is this picture of where Jesus is riding in. There's these crowds of people before and after, and it seems like they're singing back or forth, or you might say chanting, and maybe more of a chant than what we might think of singing. And they're chanting from Psalm 118, 25 through 26. That has this call, right? This idea of Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. And they all have exclamation marks behind them, these sentences. And so what's going to happen in today and the next days is going to set in motion some other things that are going to happen. And so we see Jesus going in, and they are singing, and it's really a big deal. In many ways, I'm sure people are enjoying, they're getting excited. And these words, Hosanna, means, oh, save us now. And this word will later become to be used as a shout of praise, like hallelujah. And this idea, this phrasing of Hosanna in the highest likely means save us, O God, who lives in heaven. And then it talks about blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Blessed. May God's gracious power be with someone. And of course, there is this call for the coming kingdom of the father David, this idea of this messianic hope for a ruling Messiah, for a political kingdom, from relief from their oppressors. And so there is these words and these chants, is singing, if you will, by people, many of them probably didn't necessarily all understand who Jesus was necessarily. I mean, sometimes people seem to present it that way, but there are certainly commentators that would say, well, not everybody understood this picture. Maybe many of them didn't. And they certainly didn't understand what Jesus' agenda was. But this moment of jubilation was part of the traditional Passover celebrations. And so many of them really didn't understand maybe what was happening and what it would look like upon and be understood upon in reflection. And it doesn't sound like it alarms anyone, Jewish or Roman, at this point. It's a party atmosphere. But we know that things are about to change. It's this time of celebration like it normally is and was. But we have this scene that's understood, perhaps more upon reflection, as they see the Old Testament prophecies coming true. And then we read that Jesus went into the temple courts. He looked around, and it's late, and so they head back to Bethany. And the ancient workday began at sunrise, and so this evening offering in the temple that's offered may have been more about what we would call afternoon, around 3 p.m. And and that it's late doesn't necessarily mean that it's dark. It's just that the day is winding down. The daily activities, at least in the temple, are winding down for the day. And so they go back to Bethany, and then of course the next day they head back into Jerusalem. It's it's quieter in Bethany, and it's packed, and you're going to probably won't find a place to stay in Jerusalem. It's hard, and so they head back, and then they come back the next day. And on their way, Jesus is hungry, and he sees this fig tree, right? And this is the area of fig trees and figs, and the edible figs are still about 6 weeks away. And so what's Jesus looking for? He would know this. Well, there were edible buds that would come out in March. And then that would be followed by large leaves, green leaves, and eventually, right, the figs would start to grow, and these buds would drop off. And if there were no buds, there would be no fig leaves. And so Jesus goes to have some of these edible buds, which was common for the local peasants. This would be food for them. And so he goes to eat, and there's nothing there. And Jesus makes this comment that they hear, they tuck away, but he says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And they continue on, and they go into the temple. They go into Jerusalem, where all of a sudden, the pandemonium that's there, but then Jesus, wow. He sees what's going on. He's seen what was going on, and he comes in and he's throwing people out of there, right? He's driving out those engaged in the buying and the selling. And I've talked about this before in another talk, so I won't talk a lot about that. And this may have all been a surprise if they were looking for maybe this political Messiah. For those that were, what we see is Jesus' focus isn't political on the Romans, but it seems on the Jewish nation, as we'll find out, right? So what does Jesus talk about, Esther? He's throwing people, he's out of there, and the people are traveling through, and he's chasing people out. That Jesus, in verse 17, Jesus emphasizes the need for the temple to be a place of prayer for all nations, not a place to take advantage of other people financially. And it's this point, right, that the teachers of the law, it says, and the chief priests, two groups that didn't necessarily get along, they don't necessarily see eye to eye, but with Jesus, they shared a common enemy. And so this sets in motion, they have a desire now, they want to get rid of Jesus. And so this will set in motion some of the things that are going to happen. However, of course, that event of Passover, now there's a lot more people that know who Jesus is. There's a lot more excitement. And as he continues to teach and as he creates this scene in the temple, people are getting to know who Jesus is if they didn't know before. Certainly he is becoming much more popular in Jerusalem proper, in Jerusalem. Remember, of course, he had spent a lot of time in Galilee, and this is a different area, but he is certainly gaining in popularity. And then they were told that they go back, and that evening, and in the morning again, they say, whoa, look at that. Peter notices, hey, that fig tree, you cursed. Calls that, right? It's withered. And Jesus makes this point. He says, have faith in God. Right? He talks about this relationship of faith, of being full of faith in your prayer life. Full of faith, being faithful. Full of faith. And then also the need for forgiveness. And if we go back a little bit, I was thinking of what similarities, like a wedding, the celebration of Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry. It was exciting stuff for people, the people in general. Certainly for the disciples, if you can imagine their leader being gaining this popularity now in their you might say their most important city. And this entry had lots of people that were singing. There was a procession. There was a grand entry. All of these events, right? Like in a wedding, we have all this wonderful stuff. We decorate, and we have people that come, and we have wedding cakes. We have fancy clothes, and we have all these things put together to celebrate this event. And with Palm Sunday, right? Again, just all this, you might say, hype and excitement. But we also know, right, that the wedding is not the marriage. People have said beauty is skin deep. That as much as how everybody looks beautiful and handsome on that wedding day, that isn't going to keep the marriage alive and flourishing from day to day. Their character becomes important, commitment, communication skills, and so on. That looking good for one day isn't enough. The real us will be tested. And we're going to see, like, for the disciples, they too will be tested in what's coming up. And Jesus has warned them on more than one occasion. And he's said things, and he'll say things like taking up your cross and following me. And that he'll talk about how they'll desert him. And there's all of this conversation that they don't understand and they don't embrace. That they've made this decision to follow Jesus when he said, follow me. And they decide, yes, I'm in. And they followed. And a decision can get us married too, right? It creates the wedding event. But that isn't what keeps us married. And often perhaps we talk of making a decision to follow Jesus like disciples, but that isn't what keeps us there. It requires commitment. As we know in our culture, there's only a certain percentages of marriages that last, we might say. And in one study, I believe it was couple and family group that made this study, that they had done this study, and they found that 75% of the couples who were divorcing listed a lack of commitment as one of the problems. And of the 75% of the people, should say 75% of the respondents said commitment was an issue. And of the couples, there was at least one person that cited commitment as a lack of commitment, you might say, as the problem in 94% of the cases. And of course, in other studies like Psychology Today, they'll talk about communication. They'll talk about monetary issues. They'll talk about what we might call adultery or marital unfaithfulness as some of the other causes for divorce and marriage breakdown. And we know, and so I would just say that we recognize that a decision may get us married, but it's commitment that keeps us married. That a decision to follow Jesus, yes, that's what starts us, but it takes a commitment to stay following Jesus. And the disciples are about, in this week, to find out that very truth. And Jesus speaks of, and we talk about Jesus as speaking about two important things here. He says, in that relationship, in that communication with God, one of those other critical features of a relationship, that you need to be full of faith, you need to be faithful, as well as having a place for forgiveness in your heart. Because people fail us. And we fail people. And while we may stay faithful sexually in a marital relationship, we can be less faithful in other ways. And when it comes to our relationship with God, a relationship of prayer, we're called to be full of faith, to be faithful. And to be forgiving with others, so that we too in turn can receive forgiveness from God. And as we prepare to transition to this week of the Passion Week, what we're going to see, of course, is that their commitment, the disciples' commitment and other people's commitment to Jesus, it was exciting, like a wedding day, but in the grind that follows, we might say that there are divorces. People will divorce Jesus, if you will. The faithfulness will disappear. And he will become, except for a few, very unpopular. But what we will also see, and which will be demonstrated as the days go on and to the end of the week, is that despite their lack of faith, their lack of faithfulness, Jesus was faithful to them to the end. And he demonstrated to them what not only faithfulness looked like, but forgiveness. And our next talk will further explore some of these themes. Thanks for watching.